Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the launch of State of the Newsroom 2020. I'm Alan Finley. I edit State of the Newsroom. Before we begin, a couple of housekeeping rules, which we're all pretty familiar with now. The State of the Newsroom hashtag is there, which you can use to tweet. If you want to leave comments, please leave them in the Q&A box on the right. Or on Facebook Live, you can post your questions in the comments section, and I think our technical team will monitor that. And just to let you know that this webinar is being recorded and will be made publicly available. As you know, this is a launch for State of the Newsroom 2020. State of the Newsroom reviews what happened in the media industry the year before, but this issue is being published a little late, so it should have appeared last year. However, it's done now, and with us we have a panel of 4 guests who will help us think through some of the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on the media industry and hopefully shed some light on where things stand at the moment. I would like to draw your attention to the link that's been posted in the Zoom chat. This is the latest State of the Newsroom, which you can download now and browse through. We have 3 panelists with us today. Gabriella Razzono, the Executive Director of OpenUp, Adriaan Basson, the Editor-in-Chief of News24, and Kate Skinner, the Executive Director of the Association of Independent Publishers. We are expecting John Bailey, who's the Managing Editor of eNCA, to join us, but he's a little late, so we'll see if he arrives in due course. I want to apologize to Kate for not realizing she had taken up a new position at AIP when sending out the flyer for this launch. Kate, if I may start with you. You have written an excellent overview of the impact of the first year of the pandemic on the media in South Africa for State of the Newsroom. The collapse of the magazine industry, the dramatic impact on mainstream newspaper circulation, the pay cuts journalists had to suffer, the spike in internet news readers, and so on. The pandemic also hit community media really hard, and several print titles were shut down. In your work at AIP, do you have a sense if the independent print publications have started to recover at all?
So yes, I mean, I think they have begun to recover. I think what's interesting, if you're looking at these independent grassroots publications, what happens is that when they go through very difficult times, they stop printing. But that doesn't mean that they, close down altogether. And, in the last couple of months, we've picked up that a number of publications have started printing again. Also, what's interesting is that the impact has been such that a number of our publications have actually started to experiment with, going online, actually launching websites, doing a lot more work on social media. So those are some of the positive things that have come out. But I think what's important to say is it's still extremely difficult. And all the conversations that I'm having are all around sustainability. All the training that we're doing is around sustainability and SMME development. So I don't think we're out of the woods, not at all. And I think the long-term issues around trying to find a sustainable model for community media, it's still there. It's very much there, and there's a lot of work still to do on that. Yeah.
Sorry, Ellen, you are muted.
Sorry, my mic was muted. Kate, if a lot of the community titles are starting to experiment by going online and social media and so on, are there examples of community titles that are purely online, that are looking sustainable or trying at least that as a sustainability model?
So it is interesting, yes. I mean, there are a number of our new publications that are going online, but I think what is really interesting, and this has been one of the big battles that we've been having, is this issue around, can you sustain yourself completely online? And the fact is that it seems from what our members are saying, no, you can't. There's still a lot of money, or not a lot of money, but there's still, at least some money in print. And so what it seems is happening is that it's multi-platform. What you're trying to do is you're keeping your print going because there's still advertising there, and the sense is that it will be there for a number more years, even if not even a decade. And then you also start to go online. You start to also look at your website, upgrading that, social media. But just solely going online for a number of our publications, there's a sense that is really going to be a difficult one. And in fact, just to say that I had some really interesting discussions with Media 24, with Ishmael Davidson. And he was basically saying, you know, for the small publications to go online only is not necessarily a sensible thing to do. Because for a long period, you know, going into the future, we are probably still going to need to do print. And it's not only, you know, it's also audiences still want print. And so it is a difficult one, isn't it? There are no easy immediate answers.
Yeah, something that strikes me when we look at newspaper circulation is what seems to be resilience in the Afrikaans newspapers, which is quite curious, and I'm keen to find out why that is. Just before I want to segue into Adriaan, given we're talking about the online space, but you may not know, Kate, but do you have a sense of how community radio has been doing and did over the pandemic, and how it's doing now in terms of finances or any other factors?
So this was very interesting. So when I was at Sanef and we did a whole lot of research, and Reg Rumney did research on this, it was actually interesting, easier to get information on the print media sector, print and online sector, than it was on community radio. And so the MDDA is doing research on that, and that's going to be coming out, I think, fairly soon. The only thing that I can tell you about the community radio sector is that they were very reliant on grants, and the Media Development and Diversity Agency played a very significant role in terms of making sure that funding was made available for them, and that was absolutely critical. But I think I'm really glad you're asking that question, because I think it's really important that we actually look at what happened with community radio and with television as well, because you know, in terms of the initial research that came out, there was almost nothing on that. So it's a little bit of a black hole, and I think, yeah, a lot more work needs to be done in that area.
Adriaan, if I can turn to you. I mean, Kate spoke about the sustainability of online publications at the community level, and how a mixed model is necessary, at least at this point. During 2020, as many people know now, is, you know, the top news websites in South Africa, News 24, Times Live, and IRL, all benefited from a thirst for updated news at the start of the pandemic. And News 24 in particular seemed to sustain and even grow what was a huge leap in traffic by the end of 2020. I mean, your traffic, if the stats are right, almost doubled. In the middle of this, you started your subscription model. Can you shed some light on this traffic, this increase in traffic, and how the subscription model has impacted that?
Thank you, Alan, and good afternoon to everyone, all colleagues. Yeah, I mean, the past 2 years has been a very interesting journey for News 24, not only because we had to cover a pandemic, but we also launched a subscriptions model in that period. The subscriptions model was timed for launch in August 2020, long before COVID arrived on the scene. So we were anyway going to do it, and then it just so coincided to happen within a pandemic. Alan, I won't lie, it's been from a content and traffic point of view, it's been 2 very good years for News 24. We have seen our audiences almost doubled, as you said. We have seen people staying for longer, to read for longer. The engagement time has gone up, especially on our app, which is still the biggest news app in the country. And with the subscription service, we have also seen the introduction of a solid new revenue stream, which has made it much more easier for me to ask for more journalists for my newsroom. So that conversation just became easier, which is an absolute blessing for any editor. So I think where we were in a lucky position, and I've been trying to think about this model now while Kate was speaking as well, is we obviously had the scale to start with, you know, so we came to the party with 7-10 million users per month. So, you know, we could build from that scale. We could introduce a reader revenue model from that scale. I think it's going to be very hard for a startup publication to start from scratch with a paywall or with some kind of subscription service. If you're not established, if you don't have scale, if people don't know your journalism, if they don't trust your brand yet. So I think for News24, it was really a question of saying, where do we go with this publication into the future? Where do we go next? Because as Kate has mentioned, the digital advertising, and this is no secret, the majority, I mean, last time I heard a number, it was anything between 80 and 90% of digital advertising in South Africa goes to Google and Facebook, which leaves, let's call it 10% for the rest of us to eat from or to cut, you know. So, and then, you know, there's community papers. So it's really not, I think, a sustainable model to solely rely on an advertising digital future for any website. I honestly don't see that model, you know, enabling you to build a quality probing news platform. I'm not talking a aggregation platform where you take other people's journalism and turn them into 2-3 paragraphs. I'm talking something sustainable that can keep power in check, and that can actually benefit the democracy with investigative reporting. And for that, you need money. I mean, investigative reporting is expensive. So I believe that the reader revenue model is the right one, and there's a number of them, obviously, which maybe you'll get to, but you know, the subscription one is the one we went for. A bit like the big ones globally, like the New York Times, the Washington Post, the FT, and others. What we went for was the freemium model, where about 80% of our content is still unlocked or free to read, and only 20% of our content is then for subscribers only. And that seems to work for us. We are on about, we're fast approaching 50,000 subscribers, which we think is a really great number. When we started, I had no idea what to expect. We were going into this blindly. Were South Africans going to pay for news? How many of them? You know, what's the right price to put it at? And we're very satisfied with our performance so far. Of course, there's millions more people I'd love to pay for news, but this is also a process of convincing, of behavioral changing. And I think it will happen over time, also when there's more publishers going for this model.
I mean, it's early days, but I presume advertising is still your main revenue. So it's just a question of growing the subscription revenue.
Yes, and I think it will be for the foreseeable future. News24 obviously probably gets the largest cut from all the publishers of that digital advertising part that's left after Facebook and Google took the bulk. But it's not something I think one should bank on for the future, with cookie policies changing the whole time, privacy changes the whole time. It's going to become more difficult, I think, to get to rely on digital advertising solely, although I still think it's great. I love that advertisers come to us, and you know, South African advertisers should come to all of us. You know, they should. I mean, for many years, newspapers were sustained by South African retailers and banks and cellular providers and classified advertisers, and you know, I wish you can get even just half of that back, or convince the big corporates to just give us maybe 10% more of their budgets in that space.
Adriaan, if I can go back to a point you raised earlier around the subscription model, is that I remember, I think you might have written it, it was during COVID, so the first year, and you were talking about, effectively talking about news that's in the public interest, and at that point people needed to know about COVID, and then the subscription news that's behind the paywall. Tell us a bit more about that conversation. How do you balance this public interest need and the subscription model?
Yeah. Look, I don't think, I think it's a fallacy to think that news that's for subscribers only is not public interest. I mean, that would mean every single article that's ever been published in any newspaper is not in the public interest. And we've always paid for newspapers. The New York Times, which I think we can agree is probably at the moment the best news publication in the world that produces the most in-depth quality investigative journalism, is paid for. I think there's space for a lot of models. I think there's space for a membership model. I think there's space for a to pay for article model, which we've seen popping up all over the world. But for us, it was important to say, look, what is the journalism that's good enough to pay for? What is the journalism that we think people will part with their 75 rand a month? And it's really been investigative reporting. Firstly, you know, it's obvious that when we do those big investigative pieces like the ESCOM files investigation last year, that's the type of stories that people will pay for, because they also feel that they are contributing to the democracy, to holding power to account, and to shining a light on corruption in government, which is something that we pride ourselves on doing. We also make use of technology. We partnered with a software company from Canada that helps us to identify topics and stories that the software thinks will convert subscribers based on historical behavior. So when there's specific topics coming up, or specific people that we write about, that software will flag that as potentially something to put behind the subscriber wall. It is not always easy, like you said, Alan. During COVID, we did open up some of those really public, almost like critical health articles that explained why we weren't getting vaccines or whatever, or we would sometimes open the article for a few hours during the day, and then close it again. So it's a number of reasons why we publish stuff that's locked and that's open. And like I say, we use human intelligence as well as artificial intelligence to make that decision.
A thought just occurred to me, and I'm quite curious, the demographics of your audience. You know, of course, on the one hand, you've got sort of the rural audiences watching SABC TV and listening to radio. Do you have a sense of your demographics?
The best we have, and I think unfortunately that's all of us in the digital game, is what Narrative, or previously known as Effective Measure, puts out. And I mean, you know, one can decide how much value you want to put on that. But the latest, I mean, that the Effective Measure or Narrative demographics has always put us on around 67 to 70% African readership. Basically like the demographics of the country, a bit less, and then the rest, you know, colored, Indian, and white readers. It's not surprising. What I like about our demographics is that they're quite young. So it's skewed towards 20s, 30s, and 40s, and it's evenly balanced between sexes. So it's very much all South Africans that I try to read News 24, and hopefully will one day pay us.
Thanks, Adriaan. Kate, I wanted to just leap back to you because we are on the topic of sustainability before I pose some questions to Gabby. Is that, Joe, you know, you were director of Sanef at the time in 2020, and around the pay cuts that many journalists were asked to take, as well as the lack of work for freelancers during that time. What struck me was the speed at which this happened. Is that it seemed almost immediate, which suggested to me that for many news organizations, they didn't have some kind of capital buffer in order to protect journalists at the moment. Was this a real indicator, do you think, that of the financial vulnerability of the news organizations in South Africa, big ones too, Arena, for example? Or should we take a more cynical view of passing on the kind of financial threat of the virus?
So that's a really interesting question. When I interviewed a whole lot of different journalists, some very senior journalists about this, quite a lot of them actually took the more cynical view. They said, look, absolutely, our media houses, have had a really tough time. Obviously, they had a tough time before COVID. Now there's COVID, it's even tougher. But there was a sense that, that actually they felt that, these retrenchments came at a point that, where they felt that their companies could have protected them for a bit longer. So there was quite a lot of unhappiness there. And also what came out at that particular point was a sense of there aren't strong unions to protect them. And they were very, very unhappy about that feeling of, we're really vulnerable, and at a particular point where it will be incredibly difficult for us to find other jobs. So there was quite a lot of bitterness there. And also what I found really interesting was this kind of debate around Sanef itself and saying, Sanef should take on those kind of labor issues, which was very difficult because, Sanef doesn't play that role. It plays other roles, around media freedom and safety of journalists, etc. But what I was left with was this sense of how incredibly important it is as an industry that we do have organizations that protect workers and look at these labor issues, because it comes back to bite us all the time when we don't. Then it does allow journalists to say, you know what, we are vulnerable and these companies have too much power. And we can't, and that collective power is actually really important. So thank you. An important question.
It's like you don't need a union until you really need one.
Until you really need a union.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So, Gabby, if I can turn to you, the issue that you talk about in the State of the Newsroom is essentially around internet governance. You look at the data economy, and you talk around the policy shifts. Well, it's in the context of the big policy shifts that we know are happening at the Africa Union and so on, around trying to navigate the emerging data economy, trying to provide regulatory and policy templates for countries to adopt. Adriaan spoke about the revenue issues from Facebook and Google amongst them, and how they impact on local organizations, largely because of the economies of scale, or at least one of the reasons that Facebook and Airtel have. Besides paying attention to changes in internet governance, newsrooms need to remain competitive, you argue in your article, by building local data narratives. That's what you call them. So first, for those who don't know, and I think I'm still trying to understand this properly, is what exactly is a local data narrative?
Well, so I think there are data governance and internet governance principles. So the internet governance talk more to, various kinds of governance level at a macroeconomic policy, and there are data governance issues at a macroeconomic policy too. But I think there are also data governance implications then consequently in a microeconomic level. So for how your business functions, which is sort of, and I think juggling between understanding the two is fun kind of mental gymnastics for organizations. But when I, in the article, when I'm talking about local data narratives, what I'm trying to highlight a little is that, our understanding of audiences naturally, as people try to move into sort of a digital data model, is an understanding built on, a digital market, so a digital community, which is important. But I think, even as Adriaan mentioned, there's still not sufficient data and information about the digital audiences in South Africa, let alone sufficient data and information about the non-digital audiences in South Africa. And if you understand both as your consumers, I think you start to understand where some of the broader discussions in the data economy might be of relevance to your newsroom. And for me, obviously I run an open data organization, so this is kind of my jam, but one of the chief problems still locally is insufficient good quality data. Whether that data is open or not, that is still the problem. And for many companies and many organizations, the first hurdle they need to get over is the data that they are gathering, how they're controlling it, and how they're processing and analyzing it. It sounds simplistic, but I think that's a fundamental first step to understanding how you're going to participate in a data economy, you know, at a micro level and even at a macro level.
I mean, do you envisage, I mean, for a newsroom to be competitive, does this mean, I'm trying to sort of concretize, you know, if this data, to the extent to which the data economy becomes so powerful, is, do you envisage, you know, as much as a newsroom might have an investigative journalism center, they start to have a data hub, basically, where they are managing data on South Africans, on demographics, all sorts of data that would feed into their news production.
Yeah, I mean, because I think the interesting thing, extracting value from data, understand data isn't valuable like in and of itself. You don't sell a piece of data. The idea that Facebook is selling data isn't true. Facebook is selling learnings and disaggregation from data. And similarly, you have, you know, Pfizer is a multi-billion-dollar company. Trust me, data is central to its economic model. It's just where data fits in its business model is different. Because data is, you know, a value of production. So where it fits into your product is a question, and that's different depending on what your product is and what you're seeking for your product to be. But I do think that, yeah, what that means is investing in data capacities, which is one infrastructure, right? Other is human capability, you know, human capability to do the kind of work. But I think another aspect of that, when you start to think more about, you know, what are the microeconomic conditions? So in other words, where does your business sit in a data economy? Is thinking about how you can use data better, to run your organization better, right? That's one fundamental way that data is exceptionally useful. The other is to learn more about your audience, to sell whatever the product is that you're seeking to sell, and to use data to help you rethink what your product might be, you know. So, you know, at its most fundamental, data is the basis for information, which is the basis for knowledge. But you don't get to the knowledge part without the capacities and control needed from the beginning.
I mean, that is interesting because Kate, you know, mentioned the sort of the data vacuum in a sense, or the information vacuum around community radio that's existing. And certainly the COVID pandemic highlighted how important local data was. I mean, in terms of local statistics, that became all important. There was a sense of where was that capacity, were people was it being recorded properly, and so on and so on. And I imagine with the impacts of things like climate change, again, this local data capacity is going to be all important for newsrooms. I see John, you've joined us here, so welcome. Thank you for joining us at this late.
Yeah, thanks, Alan. Apologies for joining late. I just had to sort out something.
It's absolutely fine. I mean, I do, Gabby, I do want to come back to both Adriaan and John and ask about internet governance and the extent to which they're involved in that. But John, if I might sort of leap in with you, seeing as we have you here, and this is a slightly curveball question, but on the topic of data, and it's something I don't know what the answer is, but why do pay for news channels like eNCA, like Newsroom Africa, keep their audience data private? Why, you know, why is it not publicly accessible? Is it purely clearly competition? But is that the only logic behind it?
Well, Alan, yeah, it's largely to do with obviously the competition nature of commercial TV stations. But amongst the stations, we all get the same information, and that information basically comes from DSTV, because we are all on the same platform. So we look at that. We get our data on a daily basis, and then we obviously make analysis of that. You look at ETV. That's also part of our stable. Their numbers as free to air. It's more readily available. But there's a commercial aspect to in terms of the numbers and how it's being interpreted, because we have different service providers as well that assist us with analyzing our numbers. And obviously we use that as a tool in terms of our commercial engagements with our advertisers, for example. So that's the only reason. But the information is available out there, as I say, especially the free-to-air channels that you can get, whether it's the SABC, whether it's ourselves at ETV, and that's why we can through the data that we get from what we get from especially multi-choice DSTV, we then can make an assessment as to which areas of interest we have amongst our viewers. So yeah, it's really about just being able to analyze that data for ourselves as well, so that we can position ourselves.
John, during April 2020 and the first year of the pandemic, there was a huge spike in TV audiences for the top news programs on the free-to-air channels, including ETV, and this tapered off by the end of the year. I mean, there is a sense in which both in SABC and ETV, if his numbers are correct, that there's a gradual downward slide in their audiences. I mean, is this correct? Do you have a sense that free-to-air TV news, the news programs at least, are losing audiences?
Yeah, what we've seen since about March 2020, Alan, was that there was overall an increase in viewership numbers. And it was more so for us at eNCA than at ETV, for example. We saw a huge spike in people wanting to understand what this pandemic is all about. Obviously, people staying at home, having more time to watch TV. And we've seen ebbs and flows every time that there's a change in the lockdown regulations. So by April 2020, we saw another increase as we were remaining on, we were still in level 5. But as we moved to the different levels, we saw how the numbers started moving more, or decreasing rather. And every time when there is a change, we see the numbers, and we see also the type of audience that we are dealing with. We've actually picked up a lot of younger audiences or viewers over the last say over the last 2 years. And that's for us is of interest. So obviously that's also information that we use in terms of how we engage with our advertisers. Because normally you find free-to-air channels, the age, it's round about, let's say 34 to 50, while where it's commercial or paid for like eNCA, it's normally 50 plus years old, the type of viewers. But so it's interesting to see how the viewership numbers keep on moving in certain directions. I mean, we have the issue now with what's happening in Ukraine, and that also has a direct, you can see the impact that's having on viewership numbers in South Africa as well, whether it's free to air or it's the commercial stations like ourselves at eNCA. But it does seem though that there's a downward trend for free to air at the SABC, not so much at ETV. And I think this also has to do with we see a drop in the Nguni viewers at the SABC. So that's something that we're trying to understand. Why is there a drop at the SABC in terms of free to air?
Fascinating. I mean, because you also have, of course, the isiXhosa and Zulu and isiZulu stations on the SABC maintaining their high audiences in comparison. I think we have quite a few questions that are starting to emerge, John, but before we turn to them, I mean, I'm quite curious around, I suppose there's two things. You mentioned Ukraine, and then there is a sort of conception in a sense that, well, TV, not ETV, TV is starting to become a weaker medium compared to, say, the multimedia that you can get online. what in your view, I mean, what is your take on that? I mean, it's interesting that people might, in the times of crisis, want to turn to TV as well as clearly the online multimedia content. What is your view on the power of TV to draw audiences in South Africa still?
Well, I think TV being a visual medium, that's quite powerful for people. They want to see what's happening, and because we are live at events most of the time, I mean, people can immediately capture that. Yes, you will find that obviously a lot of people, especially the younger generation, they go onto their phones and they get like a quick synopsis of what's happening in the news. But in terms of how we relay those images live on TV, there's quite an appetite for that from viewers. As I said, the younger audience, once they are on their phones, they are on their mobile devices. The older audience prefer to sit in front of the TV and see what's going on live. And for us, of course, that's important information as to how we position ourselves. Because yeah, as I said, and you can see how the international channels are really jumping onto the whole issue around Ukraine at the moment in the type of content that they are putting out especially since Thursday.
Do you mean in the content in terms of using multimedia content and so on?
Yes, absolutely. You can see they've I mean, from ourselves at eNCA, I mean, those are some of the aspects that we are looking at, of course, as to how we present our content, so that we can give a complete visual experience to our viewers.
I mean, if you mentioned that it's okay, you're suggesting that TV, purely TV, is a kind of aging audience. I mean, this must be a concern for eNCA amongst others.
Well, I mean, while we have our core audience that we focus on, at the same time, we are also building on getting an audience from that's not at the same, especially income group at the moment where our core audience is. So we are actively getting views from, or also assisting and providing content to a younger audience, so that we build our audience moving forward.
Okay. Thanks, John. And I'm glad you could join us. We have a few questions, so now it's the difficult part of trying to sort of manage them. We have a question here, Gabriella. There's been a few very good examples of data training for newsrooms and journalists, even at community newspapers over the years. Why do you think it's still a struggle to get the skills to stick? And this is about data capacity, including, I might say, at the government level.
Well, I mean, firstly, some of that excellent community training has been done by the person asking the question, and it should be acknowledged that it's all been very good at it. But I think it's a couple of reasons, but I think one of them is, for instance, that we tend to have a very siloed appreciation of data and the digital. You can see it in how people talk about it, that it still tends to be this other thing we're going to look at. And that's why I try to frequently highlight not just the data journalism side of data, but how data fits into your business model, into your entire practice of being, and understanding of your personnel, understanding of your audiences, understanding of new ways that you might be able to make money as a business. Because I think what tends to happen with stuff like data journalism, as profoundly important as I think it is for informing audiences, I think that individual journalists within the newsrooms are still given the impression by their superiors that it is an add-on, an extra fun, fluffy thing to do. And so what ends up happening, you go to a training, but then when you leave that training, you go back to the business of making news, which you think is separate, right? That it's not fundamental to how people learn about stories. And then, there tends to be an over-reliance then on the people who facilitated the training. They'll always be available to do that work for you. I don't think it's necessarily the work of journalists to appreciate digital, how data and digital is transforming the newsroom. I think that's the job of editors and company owners, and that those messages aren't being passed down. I think people need to be able to do their jobs, and the strategic decisions need to be made by people keeping their eye on the ball, and it should be clearer to people how fundamental data and digital is to storytelling. But yeah.
I mean, this does raise the issue of, which you also argue in your piece, is that newsrooms or news organizations need to become much more active into the internet governance processes that are bubbling all around them. Adriaan, if I might ask you, I mean, at News 24, I mean, is there an interest in engaging the internet governance space and getting involved in policy discussions and so on?
Sure, I've got enough work as is, Alan. Look, we are obviously very much involved with Sanef as editors of News 24. Where people like Isak Menorus on this call, is very active in leading Sanef in terms of research. When there's policy governance legislation threatening us, he would flag it and we would participate through Sanef in that. My colleagues on the commercial side are on the board of IAB. They serve there and they participate there in terms of internet measurement tools and they contract with narrative, etc. And then, of course, of late, the Competition Commission inquiry into the digital platforms, specifically then Google and Facebook, is ongoing, and that will be a biggie for all of us going forward. So again, through Sanef, we are giving input as editors, but I understand that the commercial side of the news businesses have also come together and given input into that. And then, of course, in terms of regulation, we subscribe fully to the Press Council of South Africa, and the Press Council is now fully digital as well. They adjudicate our matters. I mean, this was still a bit of a debate a few years ago, but thank goodness we've moved on. There's absolute clarity now that, as a member of the Press Council, they also adjudicate digital publication of text stories. We haven't had, touch wood, we haven't had any of our multimedia podcasts or documentaries taken to the authorities. That would be interesting to see where that would go and how that would be adjudicated. Yeah.
That's a brave new world around that, for sure. John, there's a question here from one of the participants of, it says, how does eNCA's mobile metrics in terms of unique users fare in comparison with live audience numbers? Do you have a sense offhand of that, or a rough sense, perhaps?
So can I just understand the question, Alan? Is it in terms of eNCA on mobile devices?
I think so. I think that's what they're asking. Yes. So your traffic on your mobile channels versus your live TV traffic, which is bigger? I think that's what they're asking. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, we've got about on Twitter, we have about 3.1 million followers. YouTube has, they vary in terms of the numbers that we are getting. Our focus is not so much, I mean, we provide that service to viewers out there, but it's very difficult for us to track what's happening. All that we do is we have a sense of, if we look at as I said, how many followers we have, but that's not an indication for us as to how many people are watching us. We focus purely on the viewership numbers from the TV that we are getting, and we make calls around and strategic decisions around what we see on channel, and we'll continue providing those services on YouTube and on Twitter as well to viewers.
Thanks, John. I'm going to just leap around some of these questions. There's a bit of a technical question here for you, I think, Gabby, around open source CRM for community media developed by your organization, by the way. I think the question is about grassroots media and data, if I understand. Why not use the CRM? Just could you respond to that, if it's a bit clearer for you?
They're sort of suggesting, providing open source CRMs. I think that is Yeah, and I think that's, you know, it is one of the things is to think about how digital technologies, and particularly open source digital technologies, can transform the way you manage not just your content, but also your data. I mean, we did build, for instance, with, and it links to my belief that actually improving the quality of data in this country is still the priority, you know, that we still have so many uncountables and invisibilities, that's more the opportunity than anything else. And I mean, we just did essentially like a case management system for all the Causa offices that just centralizes, you know, quite simply the case office data. And then you open it up and then you see immediately a little heat map, which tells you what topical issues are. And it sounds like a small thing, but one thing, I'm in my other lifetime a lawyer. And one of the things I can tell you is that most of the best justice activities happen at community level through community advice officers. But no one can tell you what's happening there because all that data is decentralized and inefficient. So we still have these gigantic black holes about how justice works in this country. And a simple thing like that will be transformative and can be transformative. And yet, you know, I feel like we're constantly participating in conversations, you know, like a lot of the data privacy agendas and stuff like that, which I mean, I obviously do a lot of data privacy work. And I think this is all very important to building a trust economy, which I think, by the way, is where a lot of behaviors will change. I think more and more people will be willing to pay money for companies where they trust that their data will be looked after. And I think that's a big thing to consider. I'm going off tangent, but I'll circle back. Nope, I've lost it.
I mean, do you have?
There was stuff in there.
Yeah, in your work, I mean, is there a good example of a very strong? It's not so much a data economy, but a country where they do have a robust data information that runs from the kind of national level down to the grassroots level. I mean, I suppose what I'm asking is this problem of the absence of local data just in South Africa, or is it a general problem that you've seen in other parts of the world?
I see it strongly as a regional problem. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that more fundamentally, you know, we still have digital and internet connectivity challenges, you know. And then also capacity problems in terms of education systems and those kinds of things. So I see it very strongly as a regional issue in the number of countries that I work with. And I tend not to focus too much on anything else. Yeah. Because that's what interests me. Yeah.
There's a question here from Isaac. People were talking. Hi, Isaac. We're talking about him earlier. Kate, maybe I can pose it to you. How can mainstream and community media help each other and serve the public better by sharing content, and how can that be practically done? I mean, I do want to, because I think it's worth emphasizing that this is actually partly what Gabby's talking about, is that there could be much better data links between the local and the national in the media stream as well. So, I mean, Kate, what is your sense about is there this gap? What do we do? How can this gap be attended to, and to what extent is there a gap between mainstream and commercial media and local media?
Yeah, so I think it's an incredibly important question, because I think there's a lot of work that can be done in terms of building partnerships between community media and the mainstream media. And I think, you know, it's interesting because it was definitely raised in Sanef and is being raised right now in terms of, you know, how can we gather stories from, you know, these small towns, rural areas? How can we find out what's going on there and make sure that, you know, that gets into the mainstream? And so kind of creating story banks, you know, creating a kind of SAPA, which we had before, which kind of gathers stories and then sells those stories to mainstream media, I think is very powerful and something that we've definitely got to look at. But also, I think, you know, it's not to say that that doesn't exist as we speak, because I think there's some really interesting work that, for instance, the Limpopo Mirror up in Louis Trichard has been doing with Ground Up around the lottery. you know, what is happening. And it's so interesting to look at, for instance, you know, a big, huge organization like the lottery, you know, could be giving money to all sorts of different rural projects, you know, and but what is happening out in those areas? Are those projects actually happening, or is it just an empty shell? You know, and in fact, the money hasn't been spent on anything. You know, those journalists in these small towns actually have a really important role to play in terms of gathering information on those kinds of projects, and then, you know, working with organizations such as Ground Up, which have got more of a national reach, and putting that out into the national, you know, into that national domain. So I think there's a really interesting stuff that's happening right now that we need to build on and do a lot more work on it. We mustn't have these kind of information deserts. That's something we need to work on. So yeah, thanks for that question.
I mean, that is interesting, because in your piece in State of the Newsroom, you do talk about the training of local journalists in the one situation for health journalism. I forget the exact project's name, but it is about linking to the local. And it also occurs to me that certainly in the absence of SAPA, but you know, there was a very strong network of stringers around the country, which are essentially local town journalists that could feed into the national news. And I'm just wondering to what extent that link has been broken, and projects like Ground Up are filling that, you know, in many ways.
Yeah, you know, because one of the big things which I think is powerful about that kind of Ground Up arrangement is that these local journalists are then paid to do the stories. And I think given just the levels of poverty, but also just the issue of the justice of it. I mean, if you're going to be a local journalist and you're going to be covering all of these stories, you know, that we've got to work out kind of various mechanisms around ensuring that those journalists are paid. You know, it's not just about the glory of you know, getting your story out there. So it's those kind of financial flows, if I can put it that way, that we need to kind of put in place. But we've got some models, and I think we need to look at those more closely.
Adriaan, and then I'd like to ask John too, the question around working with local level journalists, community media. Does this feature in your, or John, let me start with you. Does this sort of, to what extent do you draw on community media or local media in your TV coverage? John? Not sure if he's there.
I can go so long.
Okay,
Alan.
go for it.
Look, I mean, absolutely pivotal. I mean, I firmly believe that the future of our democracy depends on a very functioning local reporting network as well. It can't just be big publishers focusing on the metros and national politics, which is obviously our strength. So I think we're going to have to figure this out, you know, and luckily there's smart people like Kate around who realizes this, and an organization like AIP. And, you know, as Sanef, we're busy with training as well, digital training to our colleagues on the community level. We're going to have to figure out a business model as well. I mean, I think Kate is right. The journalism is pretty straightforward. I would love to publish a lot of those stories on News24, but how does that business look like? What happens when somebody sues that journalist? Where do they work from? Who funds their computer? Who pays for their data? Who pays their salary? Do they have medical aid? You know, so I think, you know, with the breaking down of local media companies and structures, we're going to have to find a new model. It's kind of exciting. I do think it's exciting as well. I think I see it certainly as a challenge, because it will be a dark day for South Africa if we no longer have court reporters in places like Kimberley and Klerksdorp and Mtunzini. You know, if it's really just the 2-3 main cities in the country that's under the spotlight, because then abuse will thrive in those courts, in those hospitals, in those clinics and schools, as it's happened in some of our more rural provinces already. Thank goodness for publications that still have a footprint in there. Just lastly, we still have in Media24 a number of community titles that we work with. So we do publish, for example, the People's Post. They're part of us, and we do have streams from them on News24 where they publish their work. So they have a digital footprint as well.
And that was, of course, the when I saw the local titles around that shut during COVID-19, there's a sense of accountability at those town levels. I was wondering how it would impact on that. John, I don't know if you're with us or if you can hear. That doesn't seem like it. I'm just trying to see if we've got a couple more minutes, and I know then we do have to close. If there's any questions around that, there are quite a few questions. Isaac, lots from you. I think we've covered most of them. There was a question around media trust, but I think it's a big kind of worms. It is that discussion is dealt with in the latest State of Newsroom. So you know, the person who asked the question might want to go and read the article where they survey journalists and media practitioners and ask them how they respond to Sanef's report on trust and ethics. France makes a point that the other area of potential collaboration between local and mainstream media is around training and skills development, and local radio stations in particular. And it does seem that we do need a lot more attention paid to that. Adriaan, if I understood you correctly, is News24 dealing with local skills development at all at the moment?
Sorry, I was referring to Sanef, that's busy
okay,
with training. Yes, Isaac Menor, Kate is also very much involved in that. So as Sanef, we're investing money in community training, and I think some of the ideas are really exciting. I think, you know, training community titles in running their own WordPress websites, teaching them in the basics of CMS how to do that is pivotal to their existence, you know, and then maybe working towards some kind of reader revenue model that can be plugged into that.
Kate, if I can give the last word to you, and then we do have to close and keep it to 1 hour. So what's in the future for AIP?
So I think, thank you. So I think the big issue for us is basically about creating sustainable models, looking at how do we survive so that local journalism and covering the whole country is safeguarded. And just to throw in, like, one of the ideas that's been put out there in terms of like new kind of models, it is actually, interestingly, looking at nonprofit models as one of the things that we have to do. You know, actually creating PBOs, public benefit organizations, for a number of our publications, which is a kind of crazy for us because we've always been little SMMEs. But I think that, you know, we have to go back to the drawing board around that. So it's sustainability, and maybe the one other issue would be, you know, going online, but going online in a way that's sustainable. So yeah, those are the kind of things we're going to be looking at, and working very closely with the industry and with Sanef around those issues in terms of building that new vision. Thank you.
Thanks, Kate. I would like to thank you and thank all your guests and participants for your time today. It's been a great pleasure speaking to you. Just to let you know that State of the Newsroom 2021 will be published this year, so please look out for that. So thank you once again to our panelists and to the technical people at WITS, Centre for Journalism, and we hope you enjoy the rest of your afternoon. Goodbye from the centre.